Hey, welcome back to Garbro's Field Desk. It's been a while, but it's been a lot of shit happening since y'all last been here. I've been sick twice, all this other drama with another channel, but that's not the important bit. The important bit is I had a little break to get better, and now we're back into the stories, some new and some old. And today I have for you Chapter 10 of the Book 1 Redo. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let's fucking go. Chapter 10. Old Histories. Yule awoke with a start, lurching up off his pillow and gripping the M9 that sat on the bedside table to his right. Sweat coursed down his body and glinted with the morning sunlight that shined through the window, and he looked around while his chest heaved in breath. Ugh, fuck. Yule groaned and flopped backwards onto his sweat-soaked sheets. He looked to his left as his hair stuck wildly to his face, and saw the empty mug that Alavara had left the night before. She had been bringing him that tea every night now to help with his sleep, but Yule was starting to believe that not even that could calm his haywired nerves. 4 days had passed since he had paid the brush feather to go and gather intelligence on the Vale camp, and they were way overdue for a check-in of any kind. The fact there was neither hide or feather to be seen of the harpies had left Yule in a slowly growing state of apprehension, and again wondering if he had sent a group of innocent locals off to their doom. Yule had even gone as far as to have Gremlin send out a drone to see if she could spot one of the brush-feathered alive, but their camouflage was so accurate to the ground foliage that she had no idea where they were, and lacked any other sensors to find them unless she found a FLIR system in a captured convoy sometime in the future. He was afraid to move out his Vale Riders to take the fight to the enemy unless he had accurate information on where they were and what they had, but nothing of that kindness was coming his way in spades. Coco was ramping up his own side of the offensive, and the weeks were filled with constant skirmishes and contacts where the men and women of Zerg Company would do battle with those from their home world. Meanwhile, there was Yule, waiting until he had all the cards he could manage to grasp in his hand. While the Vale Riders under his command raised an eyebrow at his hesitation, Alavara was taking full advantage of Yule still being in one place. This started with her joining him in the mornings more than she usually would, using her mental tendrils to lightly pull and ply at the thoughts coming from Yule. She could obviously glean far more micro-information from her own special way than by simply talking, and she started to slowly work a different kind of claw into Yule. It wasn't a hunger for power like Severus, but Alavara truly found the man interesting. His history was horrible, having caught scant memories that casted across his mind's vision, but she found an oddly strong draw to the human as a kindred spirit. They were both no longer young, but still in their prime. They both had a dour, if not calculating, outlook on life, and Yule was always bluntly candid no matter what she asked him. The longer she spent time with the human, the more she found her own mind lingering on him. She had seen and tasted far better and prettier specimens of the male spirit, but he still clung to her mind in a way she did not fully understand. Things came to an obvious spike when Yule was showing her how to shoot a pistol, the two having a moment to spare while Yule was waiting for the harpies to come back. Her heart skipped a few beats in a girlish flutter when Yule was behind her, showing her how to aim the old battered M9 at a straw bale target. Despite herself, she felt her heart hammering in her chest as he rested a hand on her shoulder, the other cupping her pistol grip and bringing it up into the correct posture. The expertise and calm that radiated off the man kept making her rapidly blink as she struggled to maintain her composure, and when he kicked her foot out a little wider in order to better her stance, she nearly gasped, only managing to make it sound like a cough. "You all right?" Yule asked her, worried that maybe he had been a little rough and should have given her more of a nudge instead of the usual trainer kick he did with his students. Alavara took a deep breath in, her pulse thumping in her neck.
Yep, just surprised me is all.
She was more surprised by her body's reaction to Yule even slightly kicking her legs wider, and her face flushed with self-frustration and the lingering arousal that swam around in her mind. More odd was that she just picked up thoughts of whoops and worry from Yule as she probed him with her mental tendrils, and it made her laugh. Rather odd feelings, all things considered at the time. She engaged Yule whenever she could, whether that was asking for him to show her things, how they worked, or helping him with the small tasks like his morning routine. Every morning when Yule arrived downstairs, she would sit next to him and have her mental tendrils poised and ready, all curled around the air like a dozen coiled invisible snakes. Every morning she would slowly slide closer and closer to Yule, making her inching gains over time. Eris, sharp-eyed and observant, noticed what Alavara was doing after the third day, but did nothing but watch with curiosity and a light twinge of jealousy. When Alavara's hip brushed against Yule one day as she sat down, her tendrils finally picked up something from the man as he looked over and tiredly smiled at her. Pleasure. A mere date, Sadir. Yule said in Tunka without the aid of his amulet, setting down his pen. Alavara smiled back at Yule, setting down a mug of tea for him.
Merta suster diet aka sidalinskas.
The sudden blank look from Yule made Alavara giggle, and she pressed down on his field cap while saying the phrase again. Yule chuckled, not realizing the good morning he had learned was a contraction of an entire sentence, and the two laughed with each other as Yule reached down to take the mug. Alavara's fingers were still looped around the handle when Yule went to take it, making Alavara blush as she kept giggling due to their fingers brushing together. Eris stared at the both of them over the rim of her own mug, her eyes narrowed while lowly growling in her throat, suffering from both second-hand cringe and general annoyed jealousy. Alavara kept up her assault on Yule, slowly wearing down the wall he kept up with the application of rubbing shoulders around the inn. Yule finally asked her to show him around the town, as he wanted to distract himself from the still missing Harpy scouts, and she gladly obliged. This allowed Alavara to now flirt and force, even going as far as fussing with his uniform one day after they had gotten done eating at a cafe. This let her stand nose to nose with the man, his eyes locked on hers as she made sure his hat was straight.
There we are,
Alavara said with a soft smile, slowly letting her fingers drift away from the bill of Yule's patrol cap.
Now you're not so crooked.
Yule gave her a new smile, one that he may have mastered as a young man and didn't get to use often in his middle age. I wasn't crooked. You're just looking at me sideways like you always do. Alavara snorted and slapped the back of her hand to Yule's chest.
Only one here looking sideways is you when I walk away.
She only knew this because of her mental tendrils catching his thoughts of her one day when she had gotten up to grab them both more tea. That's because there is plenty to look at, Yule said in a low, flirtatious tone he had not used before with Alavara. Alavara swallowed at the words, her eyes not sure whether to widen in shock or narrow in pleasure. Instead, she twisted around to hide her quickly flushing face, a hand held out in casual fashion.
That isn't going to work on me, human.
Yule, however, knew it did, just as Alavara knew she could get used to him saying such things to her. These little dates together wouldn't last forever, and soon Alavara would have to contend with the presence of Imra. Yule had been struggling to find something to do when it came to his own research and information gathering, and found some pay dirt at the library and records building within the city of Ilnoris, a few days after Alavara had kissed him on the cheek for the first time. He had gotten in contact with someone who was a master of the place, and Imra came calling one day to spoil both Alavara and Eris's morning. Imra was more than happy to show him around the place, and the two spent many an hour together among the dusty tomes and ledgers of the library. The library was a mixture of grandeur and destitute. It seemed like half of the library was simply a pile of books and scrolls with something akin to a general idea to them, while the other half looked more like a proper library system with rows of shelves and tall ladders that swung on guided rails. With Imra's help, Yule was able to dig deep into the old legends and lore of the land, with the sorceress plugging in the things he couldn't understand. The two usually sat shoulder to shoulder while they rummaged through books, having meals together as they prowled on for hours at a time for 3 solid days of reading. However, unlike Alavara, Yule felt no pull towards this woman, and would find his mind wandering back to the crimson-haired elf as his brain became bored with reading. Imra was always kind and patient with Yule despite this, meeting his frustrations with a smile and encouraging words. Yule would go to get angry or clench his fist in frustration when a lead would dead end, just to have her pat his hands.
It's okay. There's always another book to read,
Imra would say and point to the shelves. One particular record, unearthed from the bottom of a pile of books labeled Other Visitors, was the gold nugget Yule was looking for, and he ended up dragging Gremlin and 5 of the other more conspiracy-inclined Veil Riders to the library with him on the 4th day of research. Imra was a bit annoyed when he showed up with his little motley crew, but she put on a brave face and began helping them set up their crazy wall. As Yule pored over a page detailing an old war in the early Bronze Age of the realm, he looked up to see Gremlin and Imra trailing red yarn from one book to the other, Imra laughing as Gremlin happily danced among the many strings. He took a moment and watched Gremlin, his fingers rasping to a pause on the page. It was rare to see her smile, as she was usually glowering at the screens of her suffering laptops or fussing over the eternals of her overused drones. It was strange how similar yet alien the two were to each other. Gremlin was wiry and short with round ears, her hair black but not as Raven-esque as Kentucky's. Her eyes were usually tired-looking and seemed to always look strained from staring at screens. Domino had said she had a Tomoko vibe going, and there were times when Yule had to agree with the statement. On the other hand, Imra was tall, sleek, well-muscled and regal in her appearance, with her ears long and eyes sharp with wit and intelligence. Her chestnut hair seemed to have never been cut, the long braid probably able to tickle her heels if she didn't wrap it on itself with a ribbon. The eyes were the only thing their people seemed to easily share with the humans, the long ears, horns, or height being the main difference between the two beings. Yule puffed a bit of air from his nose and looked back down to his book, following a line of script before he paused and stood up with the book in his hand. The book was so old that his finger actually made a dust line along the page as he followed the elvish script, his amulet working overtime as it tried to cobble the letters together into something Yule could read. Everyone turned to look at Yule as he began to speak, walking towards them with lingering steps. Yule had been wrong. This wasn't a book, but a journal, and the person who was writing in it seemed to be writing something he had seen or witnessed. To the world of gray and iron legs we flee. With the power of the rust bloods we shall return and begin our revenge. Yule muttered, then looked up to Imra, his eyes dark with curiosity. What is this guy talking about? Imra shrugged as she tacked the last little bit of yarn in place, directed by the eager pointing of Gremlin's finger.
Probably something from the old Fey Wars. The Fey were not what they appeared to be, harboring their festering grudges against the gods. A grand struggle was born between and against every race, and those who aligned themselves with the Fey courts were known as the Chosen Children. The Fey believed they were the true rulers and inheritors of this realm, and launched their master plan to control those on this plane and bend them to their will.
Imra stepped back from the board, sighing out with her hands on her hips.
No one was really happy with the idea of being ruled by the very embodiment of madness, so the Fey were pushed into a corner during the Great Fey War, thousands of years ago. I mean, for instance, the dwarves have records that mention they were still using stone weapons in that time to bludgeon things to death, and the elves were still a single jewel compared to the many shards we are now.
Gremlin, who was tying the end of a string to a book, turned her head, her eyes wide with interest.
Grand plan, you say?
Imra nodded and sat down on a nearby chair, taking off her shoes and giving her toes a crack in order to stretch out the sore muscles.
They wanted complete and total control over all living things, mundane and godly. They were the true Fae, those beings that held the glory of having blood that was pink and flecked with gold. In their stories, the core of this planet has the same blood, the same living force, and that made them the true offspring of this place. Well, turns out that while they may be more magical, they still die when whacked over the head with a heavy stick. They and the chosen children of Ulthuri were pushed all the way down into the southern portion of the continent. Queen Ulthuri, from which they get their name, was as old and as powerful as they come, but not even she could stop the unified might of the many races.
Imra reached around the side of the chair and plucked up a bottle of stashed wine. She drank a few glugs from it after popping off the cork and tossing it aimlessly into the library, sloshing the last pull around her mouth a bit before continuing to speak.
The next bit of the legend's a little murky, as the chosen children see fit to keep their so-called prophecy a secret. But from what we've been able to gather, she swore revenge and just vanished. Took the all-powerful Fae with her too, even the few good ones. Some say she's the one who created the veil, tearing a hole in both worlds and dragging her court to the other to rest, rebuild, and scheme.
The Veil Riders were watching Imra, who sighed happily and rested her feet on a pile of nearby books while her head nestled into the plush wing of the reading chair. She had been helping them tirelessly, and she was starting to feel the exhaustion setting in after days of reading books and scrolls. Gremlin roamed the lines, tapping her hands on the thighs of her pants as Yule read on. After that little bit in the journal, it continued on about the rider's other smaller findings in some kind of old ruined stronghold, way north where the war began. But nothing else of much note was written, except for his journey home and being hounded by a debt collector when he failed to bring back any treasure, that is. Yule shut the book carefully and set it on a low nearby shelf before looking back at Imra. "What kind of Fae?" Yule asked, rubbing at his aching eyes.
You know.
Imra murmured, her eyes still closed as she took another drink from the bottle. She shifted a bit and breathed out air tinged with honey wine.
Fae folk. They look a lot like us elves, but they normally have all black eyes that are larger than ours. A lot of them have wings or can shapeshift, and they rely heavily on magic and manipulation to get their way. They also live on infidelity, never to know the blight of a wrinkle.
Imra sniffed, and Yule saw her poke a little at the sides of her eyes where women are known to develop crow's feet.
A lot of the greater Fae followed her through the veil, I suppose, since we only have pixies, satyrs, and brownies left here. Everything with an ounce of real power skipped over to the next world. Yours, I suppose.
Yule's mind had frozen after the word shapeshift, but he was polite enough to wait until Imra finished. "What does rust blood mean? Imra again shrugged her shoulders and held out her hands, one of which still clasped the bottle.
I don't know. Maybe your folk? We don't experiment with magic on your people. It can act funny, which is why I assigned Yethis to you.
What about those German fellows that came through? Yule asked, looking over at Gremlin, who was talking with the other Veil Riders and scribbling things on their crazy wall.
Oh, I read up on them after our first meeting. They partied with the dwarves till they died a few years later. They and a dwarven adventuring party drunkenly thought it would be a swell idea to go hunting trolls one night naked. You can figure out how that went.
Imra drew her finger across her neck while making a ripping noise in the back of her throat, then went back to speaking normally.
But I have found in other writings a few of the humans survived. Took care of a few issues that arose with other humans coming through.
Right. Yule murmured and patted Imra on her knee. Thanks for the help with all this. Imra raised her wine bottle in a salute, and then pressed it to her lips to drink from it again as Yule moved on to his Veil Riders. A lot of riding going on over here, Yule said, looking around with just his eyes. Gremlin spun around, her eyes fever bright with some kind of understanding and voice ringed with excitement.
Yule, what if our legends are real? What if the whole Seelie Courts thing is real, and the Unseelie Court has been farming us for thousands of years?
Yule blinked a few times, as whatever the hell she just said bounced off of his forehead and ricocheted around the room. What? Gremlin groaned angrily and pushed Yule towards the board, at which two Veil Riders were writing down major dates of conflicts and casualty numbers.
Think about it, Yule. What if all these huge wars we have had, these multi-nation conflicts and civil wars, what if they were all a way to try and power up the doorway What's-Her-Face made to get away? What if she took her court to a fast-paced world who would get her the technology she needs faster and then bring them back here to finish the job?
Gremlin was holding on to Yule's arm as she spoke and was pointing at the dates on the crazy wall. To be fair, a lot of the dates were massacres and a lot of wars indeed did have major body counts, but would that even work? Yule looked down at her, his face puzzled. Gremlin, if that was the case, how would she gather up all the blood to power her gate? Despite his lack of support, Gremlin was undeterred.
Beats me, but this makes the most sense for the time being. Grab the board, boys! We're taking this back to the inn.
Imra spoke up from her little snuggle spot in her chair, pressing her own translation amulet to her head, which made her speak English in a, curiously enough, transatlantic accent.
Board has to stay here.
Gremlin went from pointing to the board to pointing at the books.
Grab the books then, boys!
Imra leaned forward, the liquid inside the bottle sloshing, and she grinned at Gremlin.
Books have to stay as well.
We shall take the notes then.
Gremlin roared with awkward bravado after being stonewalled twice, and pointed to the legion of sticky notes they had managed to stick around the place as their thoughts were running wild with the previous hours of investigation. Despite the odd choice, Gremlin had packed away nearly 6 dozen plastic-wrapped sticky note packs in case she needed them, bringing them across the Veil. Odder still was how they never seemed to lose their stickiness, and were always erasable by rubbing the surfaces together.
That'll do.
Imra hummed and offered her hand to Yule.
Help a pretty lady up, would you?
Yule grabbed her hand and hefted her up and off the chair, while Gremlin and the other Veil Riders scrabbled at the many post-it notes in the library. After all the notes were brought back to the sparkling unicorn, and Yule had escorted Imra back to her room in the royal quarter, in which he more or less handed her off to one of the maids on hand, as she kept drinking the entire way there and demanded Yule watch her make his clothes disappear. Gremlin made her own personal crazy wall in her room and pored over it constantly. She kept this up for days afterwards while Yule waited for the brush feathered. and it was starting to get on everyone's nerves. It did give Alavara an excellent excuse to drag Yule away so the two of them could be alone, and Yule took her up on the offer just to get away from Gremlin. Gremlin was doing it still as Yule woke up one morning, rubbing the sweat from his body with a nearby towel and getting dressed with a weary sigh. Alavara had begun to be a little more handsy with him, which included hand-holding in public and a lot more hugs, and it was starting to make his dreams interesting. He rubbed at his face to work the blood back into his brain as he thumped down the hallway and knocked on Gremlin's door. It was unlocked, and he walked in to see both Gremlin and Britta standing in the middle of a spider's web of yarn string that ran back and forth from the walls of her room. On her desk, Gremlin had all of her laptops open with notes typed up on them, which casted weird shadows about the place due to the lack of sunshine on this side of the inn. You could see from the doorway that she was breaking down old fairy tales for clues, and some of the typing was in German. "Any luck, crazies?" Yule sighed out, rubbing at his temples to soothe the pounding in his head. All he had to see was the grinning of their mouths to know he was in for far more theories on the subject. Britta was being allowed more freedom in her movement when it came to the inn. Yule had his riders gearing up for battle, and they wouldn't be able to watch her anyway. At this point, getting stabbed in the back by Britta would be a blessing, because it would mean his problems would get lumped onto someone else. Before they could launch into the explanation that the
Market Garden invasion was orchestrated by an unseelie court fae who took the place of Montgomery.
and
Hitler being a changeling because clearly he was a vegetarian and liked animals over humans.
Yule just softly closed the door. He made his way down the staircase to the dining area, in the vain hope that a brush feathered was waiting for him downstairs. While he was happy to see Eris and Yethis waiting for him and heard Alavara humming in the kitchen, he would have traded them all in for a single one of his little feathered spies to be sitting there in the chair, waiting for him to wake up. He greeted them all with a groggy "good morning," and Eris clicked over on the wooden floorboards to give him a hug. This was a new thing that she was doing. You'll notice she would hug him once for roughly 3 seconds, then trot back over and sit down at the table to continue eating. This all became a part of her ritual since he told her about his unfairly taken wife, but seemed to be far more common the more time he and Alavara spent together. Yethis also seemed to be in some kind of new competition with Alavara, and she sat there slowly wavering back and forth from her place on the bench seat. Yule could see she was immensely tired and had kept this up for days, struggling to wake up early and join the rest in the morning workload. She claimed it was to keep track on the blood needed for the amulet, but the times he did need her, he would have to softly rock her awake. She usually fell asleep next to her mug of tea a few minutes after Yule would greet her, and he would begin doing his morning paperwork and correspondence while she snored nearby. Yethis's eyelids fluttered up and down as she struggled to cling to consciousness for the 4th day in a row. Yule found himself setting both his hands on her shoulders and leaning down to whisper in her long elven ear, "The chairs over there are very comfy, and I can wake you if I need you." Yethis just nodded tiredly and plodded over to the larger of the chairs that was made for Goliaths, plopping down into it and falling instantly back to sleep. She, of course, was trying to compete with Alavara, and Yethis was sure the other Valley Elf was using a spell to keep herself more awake. How could anyone naturally wake up this early every day without fail? Alavara gave a chuckle as she walked over with Yule's special tea and set it down next to him. Then she set down another mug next to Eris, who had begun to demand the same kind of tea Yule got for some reason, despite the fact it tasted awful to her and made her sniff a lot.
You can always tell the people who are not built for the early morning.
Alavara said, walking over and throwing a blanket across Yethis. Don't chide her too much. Yule said, unraveling a scroll stamped with the signet of Fawkett and laying it out on the table. I'm sure she feels left out and just wants to be included. Eris nodded from beside Yule, using her wing digits to spoon warm oatmeal burgoo into her mouth after having already eaten the sausage that was on top of it. Yule noticed he had been given extra sausage on his own burgoo and picked up the additional protein, ladling it into Eris's bowl and receiving happy churring sounds from the hawk harpy next to him. Alavara sat down next to Yule and began helping him unfold or open letters that Eris had brought in, and began pre-reading them with Yule to speed along his mornings. She made sure the side of her thigh was tight to his, and made little overtures such as letting her free hand rest on his thigh as she read. Much to her contentedly purring heart, Yule made no move to remove her hand. Whether that was from him liking it or just being too busy reading, time would tell. She read the contents of the missives out loud to him as he wrote down a response to others, forming a nice little chain of information. Then the two would start sealing up the letters for travel, rolling up scrolls or preparing papers for leather sleeves in case it rained. During the transaction of letters, Alavara would make sure their fingers always touched, sliding her eyes to Yule as he would look at her and smile. Eris, wanting to also feel like she was helping, would hold the extra wax and plop a little bit here and there in the candle warmer when they would pour some out. Yule reached over and plucked out the scroll that he knew was Coco's report. As he unraveled it and read down the lines, the hair on his arm stood on end, and a single bead of sweat began to form in the middle of his back. In the letter, Coco let him know that he had managed to capture some night vision goggles after a massive ambush against a UN platoon, and were using them to combat the daily night raids that were happening along the borders of Archery and Reganesson.
We found a column moving along the tree line, and we were watching them from the brush. We found something odd about some of the troopers. When some of my lads would pan their night vision over them, some of their eyes would light up like cats and dogs do, only it was gold and sparkly. We began the ambush and ran them off, but we couldn't find any bodies that had the same effect.
He looked up from the letter and began to truly wonder if what Gremlin said was true. Had they been among us the entire time? Yule quickly rolled the letter back up and breathed in deep, his mind buzzing as thoughts sped past at lightning speed. Could all of Britta's and Gremlin's bullshit have a ring of truth to it? He unfurled the letter from Fawkett back open and laid it out flat. Fawkett was already halfway through machining out the tools to mass produce what looked like blocky versions of the FAL and Mk.II rifles, and had mentioned in the letter that the dwarves were gearing up to go on the offensive with them due to the sudden lurch and pressure from the chosen children to the south. The Valley Elves Oni and Brimtush were already traveling to Immelnoris in order to volunteer, hearing stories of those in Archery doing the same. Yule knew the question that was looming in front of him and the right answer to it. He couldn't keep letting Coco's company take all the pressure from the Vale, and he had to start moving in to try and combat what was coming from home. In 3 days' time, the entirety of Cosmoline Company would move out and set up a field headquarters in the forest of Sanrion, and push the enemy back as far as they could. Yule let Coco know of his intentions and finished up his correspondence. He then helped clean the wax off of Eris so she could head off and take the letters to who they were addressed. When she left, Yule turned to Alavara. We're gonna have to move out here soon and begin doing what we agreed to for you guys. They're creeping their way up here, and if we just sit here and hang out, They're going to get their fingers on the city like they have the towns to the south. Alavara blinked at him, chewing on her cheek for a few moments before nodding a few times. After all, she had been surfing his thoughts the entire time.
I understand. We'll try and get everything ready for you when the time comes. I'll also let Imra know.
She reached out smoothly and took his hand in hers, lacing their fingers together as she leaned against him.
How long do you think you'll be gone?
I'm not sure, Yule said, turning his head to look down at her. Her crimson hair was brushing against his face, and he breathed in quietly, the smell of her hair imprinting onto his senses. But it shouldn't be too long. Alavara took in a deep breath, then looked up at Yule, her eyes plain with worry.
I could always come with you.
Yule chuckled, then leaned forward and gave Alavara a soft kiss on the forehead. I don't think so. It's going to be dangerous and is no place for a curvaceous barmaid.
Oh, shut up.
Alavara snorted out in a sad laugh, then leaned upwards just enough to kiss Yule lightly on the lips. She felt and nearly heard Yule's body freeze. She cleared her throat, quickly standing up and brushing her hands down the front of her apron.
I'll get more tea.
Yule didn't even have a moment to react, faltering for a word after Alavara as she damn near ran to the kitchen. Her hands clasped to her cheeks as boots rumbled above him in the hallway. When the rest of the Veil Riders came down, Yule made the announcement to everyone that they would be going on the offensive. And the riders cheered with honest vigor at the prospect of actual battle after such a long stretch stuck in town. Word had gotten out to the city shortly after, and the streets were buzzing with the news. Information was flowing in from Archery to Imilnoris, thanks to Pumperum, and nearly everyone knew of the battles to the southeast and what they were facing. They also knew of the constantly growing pressure from all the straggling refugees that came in a steady stream. On the last night, before the final day of preparation, Yule was writing a list of all the Veil Riders that were currently in the company. 66 names plus Eris, Chikily, and Yethis, who would be joining them on the journey out. He was in his room, having pried himself away from the partying down below to write this macabre list to give to Erlin, the elf who owned the inn. Yule had slipped him some gold to carve the name somewhere on the building, a place of his choice, in order to make sure the names of his Veil Riders wouldn't be forgotten, one way or another. If they truly failed and the inn was destroyed, then all was lost, and they would slip from the memory of the living. But Yule had made up his mind that this was simply not an option to even consider. Yule had just reached the 55th name when he heard the door open behind him, and he turned in his creaky wooden chair to see Alavara standing in the doorway. Around the door, the sounds of cheering and song echoed up from the dining room, and Yule recognized the voice of that bard from the first days of them being here. He also heard Chikily screeching for someone to put him down, and he hoped the harpy wasn't being tossed around or something of that nature. "What brings you up here, Alavara?" Yule said, placing his looted Bic pen down on the table. Alavara closed the door behind her to keep out the noise, and she had a look in her eye that Yule had not seen before.
Well, I didn't expect you to leave so soon, and I've been busy with preparing you and your riders before now. I had something I wanted to say before you left.
She wrung her hands nervously and seemed to be fighting with figuring out the correct words to say.
I don't want you to head out into the battlefield before I get a chance to discuss something with you. Something you may not like.
Yule drew his brows together and stood, arching his back to crack his spine. What? Is something wrong? Alavara stepped over towards him, her mental hooked tendrils open and slithering around Yule to prick and pull at whatever thought that managed to poke out far enough for her to grab.
I don't want you to go out and run the risk of dying after all these years of being alone. Since you've arrived here, you have taken none to your bed, and for 3 long years you have slept bereft of someone to warm you in the night, or hold you to keep away your nightmares.
She paused, and a few thoughts leapt away from Yule, her hooks snatching them like a cat clawing at moths fluttering around a lantern. She felt his apprehension, his longing, his lust, and his fear. Alavara stepped forward slowly and reached over to take Yule's hands into hers like she did on their little outings. She always enjoyed that both her and his hands were rough from a hard life, and she felt an odd solace in this knowledge.
I don't ask for love, and I don't ask for commitment. If in the field the urge to take another comes to your fancy, I won't mind in the least. However, all I ask is that, for one night, you let me hold you as you sleep, and keep the specters away. Sleep knowing you are cared for, and sleep knowing you are not alone. Go into the field knowing you have someone thinking about you and wanting you to come back safely.
Yule looked down at her hands, and he slowly curled his fingers around hers. Usually it had been Alavara that intertwined their fingers, but not this time. He had been entertaining an idea that Alavara was interested in him on a far larger scale, what could have been the first paths into love. He may have been a downer, but he was not a fool and knew the signs well enough. Usually by this point he would have turned back into his shell and pushed the other person away, but for some reason Alavara felt different. She was so nice to him, all the time, without asking for a thing in return. She always knew the right thing to say, the right place to take him. It was as if she could read him like a book. One night, Yule murmured, and he felt his mouth go dry. He had always been terrified to do this, to let a woman into his life again. Not for fear of losing her, but more to the shame of wondering if he even deserved to be happy like that again. Alavara then saw it for the first time, the looming ghost of his grief rising up and trying to fold over onto him like a hood. Her hooks dug into it, pulling it away as if she were a monster yanking at prey that had fallen into her snare. Alavara mentally pulled hard and felt the grief give way, her hooks shredding it off of Yule like an old blanket. The effort of it alone made a single bead of sweat trickle down her spine, treading along her flesh.
One night,
she whispered, and leaned forward on her tippy toes to kiss Yule on the forehead.
Let me take care of you. For just a little while.
Downstairs, the Veil Riders of Cosmoling Company made merry and drank as if it could be their last time to do so. Arm wrestling was had. Veil Riders took men or women to their rooms to have their own carefree fun, and others drank themselves to the point they could be medically classified as more beer than person. Upstairs in Yule's room, he felt pleasure for the first time in years, in the warmth of a body against his own for over 3. For the first time since the death of his wife, he ran his fingers through the hair of a woman and felt her breath on his cheek. He kissed along Alavara's bare flesh like a parched man finding water in the desert, savoring the salt of her skin, the feeling of her against his lips, and the sensation of her lips against him. Yule was so out of practice he nearly laughed at one point, but Alavara was patient. His old tricks slowly came back to his memory, and Alavara was caught so off guard she could do nothing but bite onto Yule's shoulder, doing her best not to make too much noise. Yule may have been out of practice, but he was not out of touch. The window to the room had to be opened so the two of them could cool down, sweat pouring off their bodies in streams and causing the sheets to stick to their skin. He drank her in at every moment, and Alavara let herself be dragged away by the waves of his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Yule slept soundly without his mind being torn apart by the hauntings of his life on Earth. Alavara stood guard the entire night over him as his own sweat dried on her skin, her mental tendrils grabbing and ripping at anything that came from his mind. Like a gorgon of dreams, she wrapped him in her tendrils and made sure nothing could disturb his rest. As Yule slept, Alavara studied his face with her crimson eyes and bore him into her memory, along with the feelings he gave her. Her fingernails traced lines down his skin to make them ripple in goosebumps, and it made her smile. She hoped deep down inside that he would be back, and that Yethis could keep him alive long enough so he could return. She could, perhaps, be foolish enough to give it another try, the whole being a wife thing, but she had her doubts that Yule would ever treat her to such a measure. After a few hours had passed, she felt no other disturbances to his slumber, and she snuggled in close to him under the covers of the bed to find her own rest. When morning came, Alavara woke when Yule did, and the two looked into each other's eyes as the early day sun glittered in through the window, basking them in the warm light. "Mind helping me get ready?" Yule asked her in a hushed tone, and with his hand he brushed loose strands of her blood-red hair away from her face.
Of course.
Alavara whispered with a smile, but she had something she wanted to do first, and they did not end up putting on their clothes until some time after they had woken up. When they had toweled the sweat off of their bodies, Alavara helped Yule get ready before she got dressed, letting Yule savor her naked form as she assisted him in putting on his battle vest, loading up all of his supplies into his rucksack and double-checking all of his gear. Every once in a while, when she was close enough, she would catch him smiling, and it in turn would cause her to crack a grin back. Yule finished his list of Veil Riders for Erlin, watched Alavara slip on her clothes, which she teased him for, and escorted her back downstairs. They left nothing in the room except the scent of them both from the night before and the coupling from the new morning. As Yule reached the bottom of the stairs, he found that all of his Veil Riders were ready to go and loaded to the nines with all of their kit. Yule squinted in annoyance as they all, of course, noticed Alavara walking down with him, and a cheer went up from Domino. "There you go, Yule!" The rest of the Veil Riders cheered and whooped along with Domino, and Yule quietly wished they had chosen this morning to sleep in as they usually did. And that is the end of Chapter 10 of the Book 1 Mk.II redo. If you like this story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk. Join us on X/Twitter, join us on Discord, and of course, you could become a Coffee member. Coffee members get discounts, sneak peek previews, teasers, basically whatever I can give you to make it worth the money. But it does also help support the channel, because, you know, we be small as a YouTube channel, and shit be hard, because I'm paying people to voice, I'm paying people to draw. There's no AI here. It's all on the weight of human beings. But most importantly, I say your name in the videos. At $50 per month, the might of the Veil Rider channel is the first shirts. These guys give $50 per month. That's Charles White, Optimus Primus, Allspark 113, E Machino, Cody Giro, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic. Huge hats off to both Cody Giro, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic. All of them have gotten over $1,000 given to the channel, with Death Dancer giving over $2,000. Honestly, they probably help pay for all the VAs and art and shit, so hats off to you. Then there be the E4 Mafia. These my fellow sham shields. These guys give $25 per month. That's James Buckner, the Great Baguette, Sonic Arrow, Splug the Goblin, Dark Side, Kiwi Bastard, Lacune 8, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, and Crusader 0625. And then there's Snuffy Squad. These guys give $5 per month. That's Split Iris Bear, Mika, Aaron Wilbur, Damon Bane Blaze. Fuck. No, not Damon. Damon Bane Plays. There you go. Scott Anderson, Verdus, Damon McEwen, Stupersync 64, Elderock Croman, Dalek, Jules, Blonde Lord, Thrace Vega, Devin Schonholtz, Andrew and Gale, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Classic Cthulhu, Ranger Uninspired, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, and Ein, the Lore Smith. Also, you guys gotta cancel your memberships. You're not gonna hurt my feelings. You have to go and tell me. If you guys have a hard month or whatever, just cancel it and hit me up later. I'm not gonna be mad at you. Like, if you have like something crop up and like, hey, I can't remember, it's fine. Just cancel membership. You know, take care of yourself first, and when you want to come back, there's no worries. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil, that was Franner, our proofreader. That was Hailey. That was Rue Ryder. That was Mocha Latte. That was Technoward. And this is Garbro's Field Desk. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.